What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video we are hopping into our starts and sits for the wide receiver position for week 3 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button, of course, if you're new to the channel, and let me know in the comments down below if you guys have any questions moving into week 3, and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, let's hop right into today's video. All right, Thursday night football, we've got the Steelers at the Browns. I'm starting Deontay Johnson. He's shown us double-digit fantasy performances in the first 2 weeks of the season, just over 11.5 points in week 1, 13.7 points in week 2. I understand that this offense hasn't been necessarily exciting. You're not getting a crazy high ceiling out of Johnson, but he can at least bring you a stable floor at the moment. I do think he's the only Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver worth starting from a fantasy perspective. Chase Claypool has not netted more than 9.4 fantasy points in full PPR. And unfortunately, George Pickens hasn't netted more than 3.3. So I've got Claypool and Pickens both as sits. I think Johnson, like I said, is a perfectly fine start. Just don't expect a crazy high ceiling here in week 3. Amari Cooper showed out in week 2 after a bummer of a week 1, 25 points in week 2, 10 targets, 9 receptions, 101 receiving yards, and a score versus the Jets. So I think he's perfectly fine as a flex, but I still don't know if I trust this offense as a whole. So I would keep him as a flex. I don't know if I love him as a wide receiver too, but he showed us enough in week 2 that you need to consider him as at least a flex option if he is on your active roster. All right, DPJ on the other hand, after a better week 1 in comparison to week 2 where he had 0 points, I don't know what to do here necessarily other than say let's sit DPJ in week 3 and just kind of sit back and see what happens. I mean, 11 targets, 6 receptions in week 1 for 12 fantasy points, and then like I said, 1 target, 0 receptions in week 2 versus the Jets for 0 fantasy points. I think all we can do is have him as a sit moving into week 3. All right, Bills at Dolphins. This might be a really fun game. I've got Stephon Diggs as a start. Almost everyone on this screen in this game is a start. Stephon Diggs is your wide receiver 1 in fantasy in all scoring formats. He looks like the best wide receiver in the National Football League right now. This looks like the best offense in the league with the best quarterback in the league. There's no question whatsoever, coming off of a 44.8 fantasy night on Monday Night Football, a 3-touchdown night, 148 receiving yards off 12 receptions. You are starting Stephon Diggs moving into week 3. Discussion done. Looking at Gabe Davis, as long as he's healthy, unfortunately he was a scratch for Monday Night Football. He did not play, but as long as he's healthy, of course you're starting Gabe Davis, who had 18.8 fantasy points in week 1. I think you sit Isaiah McKenzie. Looks like McKenzie is going to be touchdown dependent from a fantasy perspective, and even there he doesn't have a really high ceiling whatsoever, just 3 targets in each of his games this year. On the other hand, for the Dolphins, holy cannoli, Batman, 2 receivers who are also performing on a high standard in terms of fantasy. You've got Tyreek Hill as your wide receiver 4 in full PPR, and Jalen Waddle as wide receiver 5 in full PPR. So Hill is coming off of a 42-point game against Baltimore in week 2. And Jalen Waddle is coming off of a 40-point game against Baltimore in week 2. Both of these receivers had 2 touchdowns in the same game. No question in my mind, they are both starts, even against the Bills defense moving into week 3. All right, Bengals at Jets. I get it. The Bengals are looking a little bit worrisome overall as an offense, but I think this is a bounce back week. I think this is the worst defense they've faced this year, and at the end of the day, Jamar Chase is giving you double-digit fantasy performances in his first 2 games. Week 2, not as good as week 1. Week 1, he had 28.9 fantasy points. Week 2, 10.8, but he's getting it done. He is still a start for you. Don't get crazy here. We are not benching Jamar Chase. T. Higgins bounced back from a poor week 1 performance and gave us 19.1 fantasy points, a score, 71 receiving yards, and 6 receptions in week 2. I like him again in week 3. I would sit Tyler Boyd outside of like really deep or double flex full PPR leagues, I don't think he's a start for me this week. Just 2 targets last week. He always has a chance to score or put together a nice game if Higgins or Chase, God forbid, exit the game for a little bit. But at the end of the day, at the moment, I think for most fantasy managers, he's probably a sit moving into week 3. Looking at the Jets receivers, oh my goodness, Garrett Wilson. I would literally fight someone with my fists for Garrett Wilson on the waiver wire this week if I could. He is going to be a stud in this league. 9.2 points in week 1, but we don't care about week 1. Week 2, he absolutely balled out with 30 fantasy points, 102 receiving yards, and 2 scores. Is he going to replicate that against the Bengals? Probably not, but he is still a start, and you just can't risk benching him in this matchup. I think he's going to have another good game. On the other hand, we've got Elijah Moore, who I think at the moment you have to sit. I mean, it's been relatively disappointing, you know, coming off of an electric rookie year. Hasn't necessarily been utilized with quarterback Joe Flacco. 9.9 fantasy points in week 1, 6.5 in week 2. So I'll leave Elijah Moore on the bench at the moment. It pains me because I really liked him in the offseason, but just does not look like he's clicking with Joe Flacco. So Garrett Wilson's my start for the Jets receivers. Elijah Moore is my sit moving into week 3. All right, Raiders at Titans. I will give Davante Adams a start for a lot of reasons. I think most fantasy managers aren't panicking after the poor performance in week 2. He's still at 9.2 fantasy points in full PPR, but kind of worrisome, right? 7 targets, 2 receptions. He at least found the end zone with 1 of those receptions after the huge week in week 1 where he netted 30 fantasy points. Tennessee's defense does not look like they've got it, so I really like Adams. I mean, Stephon Diggs just absolutely tore them up as a wide receiver 1. I believe Adams can do the same. I'm a little bit sad about my guy Hunter Renfrow. I'm not going to lie to you guys. 4.1 fantasy points in week 1, 8.9 in week 2. This is one of my favorite offseason guys to talk about in terms of late round draft picks. And I don't know, this Josh McDaniels offense is very interesting. I don't think it's necessarily the most exciting from a fantasy perspective, and right now Renfrow is definitely not benefiting from it, so he's a sit for me moving into week 3. When we look at the Titans receivers, man, this Titans offense does not look like they've got it together. Robert Woods has not netted more than 7.9 fantasy points. Westbrook-Ikhine has not netted more than 2.3 fantasy points, and Treylon Burks has not netted more than 8.7 fantasy points. If I had to start one of them, it would probably be Treylon Burks, but I wouldn't be in love with it whatsoever. At the end of the day, if he could find the end zone, he actually isn't putting together too bad of stat lines, but you just don't get a good ceiling here. If he could have a breakout game, maybe that changes. So like I said, if I had to start a Titans receiver, I'd go Burks, but overall, we want to sit the Titans receivers moving into week 3. All right, Saints at Panthers. Oh my goodness, Michael Thomas is balling out. He looks like he is way back to true form. 18.5 fantasy points in week 2, a score, 65 receiving yards off 6 receptions after his 22.7 fantasy performance in week 1. You're starting Michael Thomas versus Carolina. There's no question in my mind about it. I think Chris Olave is a pretty good flex overall in full PPR leagues. 9.1 points in week 1, 10 points in week 2. He looked better in week 2. And the important thing is he had 13 targets in comparison to 3 targets in week 1. So I don't mind him as a flex if you don't have better options in week 3 against the Panthers. I'll leave Jarvis Landry as a sit for now. Tale of 2 stories, 18.4 fantasy points in week 1, 6.5 in week 2. I do think he will have productive games throughout the year. The issue is it's going to be difficult to kind of figure out when those productive games are going to be. So I'll leave him as a sit for now. I think DJ Moore of the Panthers is an okay flex. I'm a little bit worried about the Panthers offense. Not going to lie to you, except for Christian McCaffrey, man. I'm all here to root for my guy Baker Mayfield, but he has struggled through the first 2 weeks of the season. DJ Moore is suffering from that. 8 fantasy points in week 1. He did hit double-digit fantasy points in week 2 at 13.3. Where you drafted DJ Moore, you drafted him to either be your wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2. He is looking better off as a flex player. Hopefully he can pop off, but he does face Marshawn Lattimore. It's a tough matchup overall, but at the end of the day, I still think he's a decent flex. You just have to temper your expectations overall, and I would bench Robbie Anderson. I know he had the big week 1 and everything, but then in week 2, 3.2 fantasy points does not make me feel very confident in starting Robbie Anderson moving into week 3. All right, Ravens at Patriots. Rashod Bateman, someone I slept on way too much in the offseason. 13.9 fantasy points in week 1, 20.8 in week 2 in the shootout game versus Miami. 7 targets, 4 receptions, 108 receiving yards, and a score. I like Bateman again as a big play opportunity player in week 3 versus the Patriots. I like the Ravens in this game overall. I like Devin Duvernay as a solid flex. 21.4 fantasy points in week 1, 12.2 in week 2. I think he's due for another good game. I do think he might have some tampered ceilings, but he is a player who can offer a nice ceiling. I mean, him and Bateman are very similar players overall. I've enjoyed watching these two become the number 1 and the number 2 with Hollywood Brown exiting that offense, and I think that Duvernay is a very solid flex moving into week 3 overall. And then we take a look at the Patriots wide receivers. I would bench everyone except maybe JAKOBI Meyers, who's a decent enough flex in full PPR leagues. 10.2 points in week 1, 18.5 points in week 2 versus Pittsburgh. A much better week overall in week 2. 13 targets, 9 receptions, 95 receiving yards. He is probably the only Patriots offensive player outside of Damian Harris I'm confident in having in starting lineups at the moment. I think he's a perfectly fine flex in full PPR leagues moving into week 3. All right, Lions at Vikings. Man, oh man, Amon-Ra St. Brown looks like the next superstar in the NFL. I think he's going to have a lights out season. I am absolutely thrilled to watch this man play football. Of course, he's a start heading into week 3 against the Vikings. 20.4 fantasy points in week 1, 39.4 fantasy points in week 2 versus Washington. 12 targets, 9 receptions, 116 receiving yards, and 2 scores. Let's end it. You're starting Amon-Ra St. Brown, and kudos to him. I think he's going to have a fantastic year. I'll leave DJ Chark as a sit. After the solid performance in week 1, he had 0 receptions off 4 targets in week 2, so I'll leave him as a sit. We need a larger sample size for me personally before we start throwing him in our weekly lineups on a consistent basis. I don't hate Josh Reynolds, but I would give the same argument for DJ Chark as I would with Josh Reynolds in week 1. Reynolds did not have a good game. In week 2, he had a decent game, but really if you take away the touchdown, there's not a lot of productivity there. So if you were thinking of starting Josh Reynolds in deeper leagues or full PPR leagues where maybe you have a double flex, I don't love it versus Minnesota. But the thing is with Reynolds and DJ Chark, the way that this offense is looking, they're going to have sporadic times throughout the year where they have good fantasy stat lines, but the consistent players, obviously Amon-Ra St. Brown, so he is the only solidified start for me moving in to week 3. All right, Justin Jefferson. Of course, you're starting Justin Jefferson, no doubt about it, right? Week 1, 39.4 fantasy points. We all know the tale there. Then week 2, Darius Slay. I don't want to say shuts down Justin Jefferson, but basically shuts down Justin Jefferson. Still netted over 10 fantasy points, 12 targets, 6 receptions, 48 receiving yards, no scores. It doesn't really matter. I mean, it mattered for that game, but moving forward, there's no doubt about it. You're starting Justin Jefferson on a weekly basis. Adam Thielen, on the other hand, I'm going to leave as a set. Has not netted more than 9.2 fantasy points. He had a better week overall in week 2 against Philly, where he had 7 targets, 4 receptions, 52 receiving yards. But at the end of the day, I'm going to leave him as a sit until we see a more consistent stat line overall, which does pay me because I am a fan of Adam Thielen, and I really thought him and Cousins would show that same chemistry in the red zone that they've shown in recent years. But for now, moving into week 3, I've got Thielen as a sit. All right, Eagles at Commanders. I like this game script, right? here. I like this. That's going to be a fun game. I'm telling you guys, the NFC East is getting a little bit more competitive overall, and I like that. So I've got AJ Brown as a start, 25.5 fantasy points in week 1, 11.9 in week 2. Not as good of a performance in week 2, but really the Eagles just did not need him to perform as well. They were all balling out on all cylinders. I've got DeVonta Smith as a start this week. He redeemed himself for me, one of my favorite players in the offseason in terms of mid to late round draft selection. 7 targets, 7 receptions. Thank you, DeVonta Smith. 80 receiving yards, 15 fantasy points in full PPR after having 0 receptions in week 1. So I like Brown. I like DeVonta Smith. I like this matchup. I think both receivers could eat once again. On the other hand, we've got the Washington Commanders wide receivers. I like all of them going into this matchup. I like Terry McLaurin, who had 12.2 fantasy points in week 2. I like Jahan Dotson, who had 17.9 fantasy points in week 2. And I like Curtis Samuel, who had 22.9 fantasy points in week 2. I can't believe that the Washington Commanders of all teams have an absolutely stellar receiving core, and I think that all of them are worth a start moving into week 3. All right, Chiefs at Colts. I've got the Chiefs wide receivers as a sit because, guys, I just can't pin on who to recommend as a start. You know, if we look at week 2 alone, McCole Hardman had 7.5 fantasy points. MBS had 3.3. Juju had 4, and Sky Moore had 0. So I guess if I'm starting a Chiefs receiver, it's Hardman, but I just don't love starting any of these players whatsoever. Hardman has been the most consistent, but he's still a boomer bust type player. So I'm not confident enough to tell you guys to start any of the Chiefs receivers point blank. And the problem is any of them could ball out, any of them could have great games, but we just don't know. And the way that offense is working right now, they are running the football, they are throwing to the running backs, they are obviously utilizing Travis Kelce, and Patty Mahomes is just throwing to anybody and everybody. So it really doesn't benefit us from a fantasy perspective outside of maybe Travis Kelce, CH, and Patrick Mahomes. So at the receiver position, I should say, does not benefit us. So I've got the Chiefs receivers as sits. Michael Pittman, if he is healthy, there's a chance he will play in week 3 from everything that I've seen. So let's assume he is playing. He's a start, right? This is the only receiver for the Colts who should be listed as a start. And outside of Jonathan Taylor, this is the only player on the Colts from a fantasy perspective we should be considering. I hope that Pittman is healthy because boy, does that Colts offense and Matt Ryan need him moving into week 3. All right, Texans at Bears. I think that Cooks is a solid flex overall. 15.2 fantasy points in week 1, 9.4 in week 2 versus Denver. He has at least 10 targets in each game. So full PPR, Cooks is still a perfectly fine veteran start, but he just does not offer a high ceiling. So I don't necessarily love him as a wide receiver too. I think he's better off as a flex. I'm hoping to see some bigger games out of him as the season progresses. Darnell Mooney, on the other hand, I've got as a sit. You guys, Mooney barely has 2.4 fantasy points on the season. It is just a really, really bad look overall. I don't know what to make of this because I absolutely loved Mooney in the offseason as a whole. I really thought he would be a great consistent player in full PPR, but at the moment, if you own Mooney, he's a bench. You just have to sit back and see what happens. There could come a time in the season where we drop Darnell Mooney, but let's not panic quite yet. He gets Houston, the Giants, Minnesota, and Washington, so he's got a little bit of a stretch here where he can make some noise, but I do think at the moment it's best to have him on your bench and let this thing play out. In terms of any of the other Bears receivers, Pettis, St. Brown, anyone else hanging around there sits for me as well. We'll see how the Bears offense and the receivers overall look moving into week 3. All right, Jaguars at Chargers. I think this is going to be a good game, man. I think the Jags are going to actually surprise some people, but I do think that the Chargers are the better team as a whole. With that being said, man, Christian Kirk is absolutely a start for me. Moving into week 3, man, did he take notice of the entire league saying you are paid. Why in the world did this guy reset the wide receiver market? Well, at the moment, Christian Kirk is your wide receiver 7 in full PPR, 7.7 fantasy points in week 1, 25.8 in week 2. At least 6 targets in each game. He had 78 receiving yards and 2 scores in week 2 versus the Colts. Christian Kirk is a must-start player, especially in full PPR leagues. He is, and I mean, at the price you got him in drafts, if this is your wide receiver 3 or 4, boy, are you ecstatic right now. Christian Kirk is a start. There is no doubt in my mind about it. Zay Jones and Marvin Jones for me at the moment are sits. I don't think there's any reason to start either of them. They have not been consistent enough on the season. On the other hand, with the Chargers, as long as Keenan Allen is playing in week 3, he is a start. Really no question about it. Didn't have the greatest game in week 1 at 10.6 fantasy points, but he's still Keenan Allen. You're still starting him if you own him. Unfortunately, he did miss Thursday Night Football versus the Chiefs. And of course, you know, his week 1 stat line was hindered by the hamstring injury as well. Mike Williams, on the other hand, smacked you in the face in week 1 with just 2 receptions for 10 receiving yards, a whopping 3 fantasy points, but man, did he make up for it for a lot of fantasy managers in week 2 at 25.3 fantasy points on Thursday night, 8 receptions, 113 receiving yards, and a score. And on top of that, some really contested, really good catches overall. Mike Williams just absolutely balled out. He is a start on a weekly basis, and you knew when you drafted him he has that boomer bust potential on a weekly basis, but at the end of the day you just have to start him if he's on your roster. Josh Palmer is a watch for me after showing a little bit more productivity in week 2. 8 targets, 4 receptions, 30 receiving yards, and a score. That was, of course, with Keenan Allen out. But now the question is, how much more do the Chargers utilize him to try and keep maybe Keenan Allen healthy? And did he do enough on Thursday night to kind of solidify that role as the wide receiver 3? So keep an eye on Josh Palmer as a whole. I do think that he's worth keeping an eye on. But DeAndre Carter at the same time, who had 3 targets and 3 receptions, probably also worth keeping an eye on. It's going to be interesting to see who really steps up and solidifies themselves as the wide receiver 3 on this team. All right, Rams at Cardinals. I like this game script. I like this matchup. It's an important divisional game for both teams. So Cooper Kupp, I mean, no doubt about it, he's a start on a weekly basis. At least 30 fantasy points in his first 2 games of the season. Are you really surprised? No, he has at least 11 receptions, at least 1 score, and at least 108 receiving yards. And like I said, at least 30 fantasy points in each of his first 2 games. Like, okay, I mean, we can move on. We all know who Cooper Kupp is. You're starting him all day long, and I do really like this matchup for him this week. Allen Robinson redeemed himself, 15.3 fantasy points in week 2, a score off 4 receptions and 53 receiving yards. I think you can start Allen Robinson again here against the Cardinals. Like I said, I like this game script for everyone involved. I think it's going to be a good game overall from a fantasy perspective. I like Hollywood Brown in this game as well. 12.8 fantasy points in week 2, 14.3 in week 1. If you own Brown, you're starting him. He's still Kyler Murray's #1 option within this offense, so I think he's a perfectly fine start. If you're thinking about starting AJ Green for any reason, I wouldn't do so. I think he's a sit. But my guy, Greg DORTCH, is a start for me in full PPR leagues. 13.3 fantasy points in week 1, 15.5 in week 2. He did find the end zone in week 2 off of 4 receptions and 55 receiving yards. So I like him as a start in full PPR leagues. I think he's going to be actually a pretty consistent player. It'll be interesting to see if and how he's utilized when DeAndre Hopkins comes back in a few weeks. But overall, I really like this matchup. I would try to exploit it from all angles. I think it's going to be a good game from a fantasy perspective overall. All right, Packers at the Buccaneers. I got Allen Lazard as a start. Boy, was it nice to see him back. Was it nice to actually see the Packers offense look like a offense that can manage themselves overall. Allen Lazard only had 3 targets in week 2, but 2 receptions, 13 receiving yards, but most importantly, 1 touchdown. I get it. Just 9.3 fantasy points against the Bears doesn't necessarily excite you, and he gets the Bucs defense this week. But at the end of the day, this is Aaron Rodgers' #1 target. There's no doubt about it. In my mind, you've got to start him. Sammy Watkins, it's worth noting, had a pretty decent week 2, 12.3 points in full PPR formats. Randall Cobb did not have a good week at 6.7 points. Christian Watson, not a good week at 3.9. And my boy, the doobie, had 4.7 points in full PPR. So just a full scale picture there of the Packers receivers. Amari Rodgers had -1 point. So there's a real full scale picture. We have to keep an eye on this receiving room to see who starts to emerge. At the moment, it looks like potentially Watkins, but we don't have a large enough sample size. He did have 93 receiving yards and 12.3 fantasy points, like I said. So keep an eye maybe on Watkins, but at the end of the day, if you're starting a Packers receiver, it has to be Allen Lazard. All right, I've got the Buccaneers wide receivers as sits. I don't quite know what to do with this receiving room. At the moment, it is an absolute mess. They just signed Cole Beasley to their practice squad. I don't know what to do. Julio Jones, if he starts, I think is a fine flex, but he missed week 2. Scotty Miller led the team with targets, with 8 targets against the Saints. Do I want to trust Scotty Miller? I'm not quite sure. Russell Gage, on the other hand, had 6 targets and 5 receptions for 28 receiving yards. Nothing great there. Mike Evans is suspended this game for knocking the crap out of Marshawn Lattimore, and Chris Godwin is hurt. So I think at the moment, at the time that I'm recording this, they're all sets for me. Like I said, if Julio is healthy and suits up, he's a fine flex. But outside of that, I'm just not crazy about the Buccaneers receiving core, and I doubt you are either moving into week 3. All right, Falcons at Seahawks. Drake London to start for me. A nice start to the rookies season. 12.4 fantasy points in week 1, 24.6 in week 2. He found the end zone, had 86 receiving yards and 8 receptions. Hey, shout out to our boy Drake London. He is not on the best team whatsoever offensively, and he is getting it done. And I think he has another good week against the Seahawks point blank. On the other hand, we've got DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett in a really bad position overall with Geno Smith as their starting quarterback. So listen, I put them as a sit, but like you can still consider starting either of these players. Lockett had a really good week in week 2 versus San Francisco. 11 targets, 9 receptions, 107 receiving yards. But in week 1, he only had 3 receptions for 28 receiving yards. Metcalf, on the other hand, has not topped more than 36 receiving yards on the season. He has averaged about 6.5 targets throughout the first 2 weeks of the season. So I don't hate Metcalf or Lockett. I just don't feel great about either of them in my starting lineup. So at the moment, Lockett had the better week 2, but who knows what's going to happen in week 3. It's just an uncertain offense. So I've got them as sits moving into week 3. All right, Niners at Broncos. Debo's going to be a start for me. 11.6 fantasy points in week 1, 14.7 in week 2. I know he hasn't reached those same ceilings that we saw last season, but overall, if you drafted Debo, you've got to start him. As long as he's getting you those double digits, he's still worth a start. Brandon Ayuk, I think, is a fine flex. He hit 11.3 fantasy points in week 2. I think he's a okay flex. Like I said, a fine flex, but I really would like to see some higher ceilings out of these Niners receivers. Maybe we'll see it in what we can hope is finally a shootout game for the Broncos, but we just haven't seen that out of Russell Wilson and company. With that being said, you're still starting Cortland Sutton. He's still having a good fantasy year. 11.2 points in week 1, 19.7 in week 2. He had 11 targets, 7 receptions, and 122 receiving yards. That was with Jerry Jeudy exiting the game. He is considered day to day with a chest injury. If he plays, if he suits up, I still think he is worth a start moving into week 3. All right, final matchup of the week. We've got the Cowboys at the Giants. I'm starting CeeDee Lamb. He did okay without my guy Dak Prescott. Still at 15 fantasy points, 11 targets, 7 receptions, 75 receiving yards. So as long as he play in full PPR, I think he's going to be just fine. Even if I chose a picture where I cut off his hand, he's going to be fine, guys. And outside of that, I really like Noah Brown. We talked about Noah Brown in the waiver wire video. 11.8 fantasy points in week 1, 20.1 in week 2. I think he could be due for another nice game. I think Noah Brown has really stepped up and filled that role of Michael Gallup as the wide receiver 2 on this team. So I like Lamb and I like Brown. I think that they will be fine in this matchup with Cooper Rush as the starting quarterback. On the other hand, in terms of Sterling Shepard, I think he'll be okay in this game, but I don't love the ceiling. I've got him as a sit. I think that the Cowboys defense is going to play really well. They've actually already played really well throughout the season versus the Bucs and the Bengals. The Giants are easily the worst team they've faced all season long. Shepard had 15 points in week 1, 9.4 points in week 2. He is definitely the wide receiver 1 on this team. I don't think you need to consider starting anybody else on this team who is listed as a wide receiver. But like I said, I don't see a good ceiling for Shepard even in full PPR leagues in week 3, so I've got him as a sit. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content, be sure to hit that like button on the way out, hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you are new to the channel, really does help out. And drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. It could be advice on quarterbacks, kickers, defenses, tight ends, wide receivers, running backs, whatever it may be, waiver wire trades. I'm happy to help you guys. And like I said, I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.